welcome. This is the third installment of Silicon Valley Knowledge, and we're super pleased to have Björn and David back. It's a standalone conversation, so you don't have to sort of have the previous knowledge of the first two, so you're welcome to join the conversation here and now, so to speak. But without further ado, Björn Jeffery, a tech analyst at Svenska Dagbladet, and David Larsson, Heidenblad, historian at Lund University.
Thank you. Welcome back. So for those of you that have joined us for the first two, this is the third and final session. We thought maybe today we're going to go a little bit more practical and go through what type of methods, knowledge, structures that we have used or we have that maybe we think that we will use going forward. But maybe before we did that, like a word on what have we been trying to do over these three sessions? What is this that has come to this head that where we're at today?
Yeah, maybe that also takes us into these kind of books, because me and Björn, we got to know each other through mutual acquaintances. I thought that you should know each other, which is this Silicon Valley cultivating serendipity kind of way. And then a couple of years ago, we did a workshop which I organized with scholars and journalists, and there we had like some a small book club, spoke about a couple of books, and when we have like continued an intellectual conversation ongoing all the time, but then we thought like this was great. We should do it try to do it in public and see what happens if we do it in public. And I'd say that is how we are here. We are prototyping something, I'd say.
Yeah.
And taking something from a closed setting into an open one, and then be open to what happens and how things resonates, and so like all these three installments have been that kind of tryout. And I mean, I do that regularly as an academic. I have like the first thing we did here when we had talked about the books and the Silicon Valley sort of canon of literature. I've done that on multiple universities in different settings, and it has worked there. But just because scholars are interested does not mean that anyone else is interested and think this is interesting. So that is like that kind of permanent beta thing is something which takes us here.
It's true.
And
I think one aspect to keep in mind is I think this is a very misunderstood part of the world. I think Silicon Valley is something where you maybe have an overly rosy image of, or an overly critical image of, saying these are techno-optimists trying to take over the world, or this is basically a methodology for running your life. And I think what we've been trying to do a little bit is nuance. It's probably not either of those two. It's somewhere in the middle, as most interesting things are. So with the basis of some of these, some new books today, we're going to go through a few kind of methods and concepts that you could use even if you're not in Silicon Valley, and even if you're not necessarily even in tech. There's still knowledge to be drawn from Silicon Valley that we think could be useful for you.
Yeah. And one like of the basis things we took up on the first conversation was, I think we used these two books, like Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 and Andy Grove's Only the Paranoid Survive. And this is from 95, 96, and this is from 2012 or something like that. And the thing that these books are sort of handed out all over the world, are read all over the world, and they keep getting read, even though, like in this case, for example, the examples are very dated. It's the last chapter here is about will the internet be a thing or not, and it was. Still, it keeps on printing and keeps on getting read. And I think we'll start with this book because it's the oldest one we have here today, and it is written. That is at the dawn of the internet age. So it's began to be written before like Netscape has been IPO'd, and it is published after Netscape is IPO'd. So it's like exactly in that very special moment in time, and like the beginning of the IT, what we later see as like the IT bubble or IT craze, something like that. And it's all about how you handle uncertainty, and how you handle big changes, and how you can act even if you don't know what is going to happen. And if anything of that sounds familiar today, it's because that is sort of a permanent fixture of living in through as we all are doing here, like living through a digital revolution in various phases. And Andy Grove here is sort of perfectly positioned to write this book, as he was the CEO of Intel and had been in Intel since the late 60s when the company was found, and lived through. And is like the prime example in this book is about when Intel changes from creating memory to creating microprocessors in the mid 80s. So like they throw away what has used to be like 98% of the business, and then they change. So how you dare to abandon something which is working or which has been working for a very long time, and embracing something new.
How would you say that how have you used this? If you're not a memory maker in
No.
the late 80s, how have you applied this?
Well, I'm a researcher. I'm a historian, and historians, we work in fairly long projects. So we study things for like, I'd say 5 to 10 years or something like that. And after that, at least I feel like I'm exhausted. I don't have that much more to say. And then you have to sort of change course, study something new. Because, I mean, there are researchers, of course, who study the same things for a whole career, for like maybe 50 years. I would get bored, but I don't get bored after 5 years. So I know that is strange to people in different worlds, but as an historian, I'm swifter. So, and one of his techniques here in this book is that you should, he said, talk about companies, that companies should always be exploring, always testing, always building relationships, because you don't know what you will be doing in 5 years. So you have to invest before you get into trouble, sort of. And I'd say like the research project which I'm about to start now about Silicon Valley knowledge and the relationship between Sweden and Silicon Valley, which I think I'll start like in the autumn, more like for real, that I go on the money, as we say in academia. That has been growing out since, I'd say, 4 or 5 years or something like that, when I started to talk to colleagues, and maybe somewhere that's interesting, let's do a workshop on it. And then we did a workshop, and then I met Björn. And that is something which you do, like you are financed to do one thing, but you use the financing to sort of R&D new things as well.
You're essentially planting seeds in a way.
Planting seeds
without really knowing what's going to grow out of it.
No, and it doesn't have to get like, so for example, the workshops we did, they were fun in and of themselves. It was good it was lunch to lunch, so it's not that big of an investment. You gather 12, 14 people that you like, or that you like from different worlds, and you like to get them together, and you see what happens. And that spawned seeds sort of for like, I think when we first met, it was like this wide, and then we realized maybe it's this that we should do. So, and that is good to do at an early stage, because it's you are not that invested. It's easy to course correct, and I'd say also the things that we do here today, which are sort of done. In my case, as a researcher, I do this sort of pre-research, like between application and between actually doing things. So it's not that you report something which you have been studying for 10 years. You ramp it out in the open early on, because you never know what happens.
There's also something about the friction here, isn't there, in this, and who does this and who does not. I think anyone who works in a company could feel this is interesting in theory, but most companies don't do this. There's an inertia almost, where like that sounds like an interesting theory, but for our specific case, it's best if we just keep doing whatever we've always been doing before. That's where most companies tend to end up.
Yeah, and maybe most individuals as well.
Yeah,
that you do the things that work well, and you underinvest in the things with a very uncertain outcome. But over longer periods of time, it's very dangerous not to invest in these certain things, where Intel today is, I'd say, a prime example of a company that sort of leaves this
underinvested and underchanged in a very, very changing semiconductor market.
But I'd say this book is really, even if you're not interested in anything of the topics in this book, this is a very interesting book written by a super smart person who actually have lived through and navigated change.
Yeah.
And one very interesting thing that I also taken with me is that the people who are has the hardest time to sort of really change are the people who are at the top, because they have succeeded in one game. But as the game changes, they are the last to know, because the people will not report. A lot of people say what the person at the top wants to hear, which makes it a very dangerous position to be in, because it's easy to play yesterday's game. And to be aware of that, you need to be a little bit paranoid in order to sort of keep being at what took you to the top is not what you're going to keep you there.
I think this is a good start, because this is something that underpins a lot of Silicon Valley. I don't know if most Silicon Valley companies would necessarily be able to name check Andy Grove necessarily,
No.
but it is the undercurrent of almost all of these things. As you have a big, large, successful company, they're reluctant to change. The smaller ones come up from underneath and try to sort of circumvent, and then this cycle continues. They get old, lazy, and then a new generation comes along and eclipses them in some sense. So it's sort of, even if you haven't, most Silicon Valley people may not have read the book, they're probably running that playbook anyway, whether they know it or whether they don't.
Yeah. So what do you want to continue with, Björn?
Yeah, we'll continue with this one, I think it is.
Yeah.
This is a classic, Jim Collins, Good to Great. Not necessarily a Silicon Valley book solely, but sort of a staple in management literature. Speaks about something called the flywheel, which is probably something that you're familiar with somewhat. Flywheel is essentially it's almost described as a spiral, in a sense. You do something which leads to something else, which in turn helps you with the first thing, which sort of it gets better and better and better. An example of how we use this at Tokaboka, this gaming company, as we spoke about last time, was parental recommendation. Because we spent a lot of time in the beginning of this app company for kids that I was running, trying to convince parents why this was a good idea, because this is not an obvious thing. And we realized after a while that there were basically 3 levels of trusted partners when it comes to things for your children. Who do I listen to if I want to find a recommendation of some sort? And the first one that you almost always take the recommendation of is a pediatrician. If a pediatrician says your kid should have vitamin E, chances are you're going to go to the pharmacy and buy vitamin E. Why? Because they said so. It's pretty obvious. The problem for us in this case is pediatricians do not care about kids' apps. So the chances of them recommending us was very slim. Like in theory, but like they worried about more bigger things in life, which in this case was a good thing. The second tier is teachers. If the teacher says you should do something for your kid, you're probably going to do it, but not necessarily. Not the same level of confidence as a pediatrician. So the teachers may do it, and again, this is a category where some teachers, more progressive, maybe think kids' apps are an interesting kind of category that you could look at, but not necessarily. And then the third one, which is the broadest, but which is the one which you may not necessarily follow the advice, is other parents. So pediatricians, teachers, and other parents. And we knew that these first 2 categories were sort of out of reach. Like, it'd be great if the pediatricians talked about us, but that's just not realistic that they're going to do that. So we got to go for the hardest group, which is parents. And in this case, if I give you an advice to say, oh, I think your daughter would like this, you'll filter that and say, you say that, but my daughter's like this, and I've met your daughter and she's like that, so that's not going to be very good advice for me in this specific case. So it's a much broader but much harder thing to do. But when we spent so much time with the parents and trying to get parents to understand why we were doing this the right way, the recommendation effect starts. And in a market, which the kids app market was, and arguably still is, where information is very low, you don't know what's good. You have no idea. You're basically the equivalent of walking down, a supermarket aisle trying to buy cornflakes. And on this aisle, there are 30 packets that all say cornflakes, the most nutritious version. They all say that. That at least 9 out of 10 are lying. Maybe all of them are lying. Maybe none of them are the most nutritious, but you have no way of knowing which one is the best. So what do? You trust the recommendation of someone else. So the flywheel effect, to go back to that in this specific case, was trying to build heavy trust with parents that could recommend to other parents that if they had a good experience and understood what we were trying to do, this digital toy versus game, for instance, would recommend to other parents that then have siblings that can continue. This company was just last week 15 years old. It's still going off the basis of recommendation. This is the flywheel effect in practice, but it was a very long flywheel, maybe not the one that's you obviously hear about, which is sort of these super hyper-growth thing. This was kind of in this case, a decade and a half project, in this case, trying to get the flywheel to work.
And the flywheel is often, I think Bezos often uses the flywheel effect as well with like the Amazon thing, but if you lower the prices, then you get more customers, which makes more profits, and then you can sort of lower the prices even more, so that you always invest in like getting the flywheel to turn, in a sense.
Yeah,
So
and Amazon was very early with that, but when it was called, it used to be called collaborative filtering in the old days, which was essentially the more people you have on your website, the more data you have, the better recommendations you can give, and then the better recommendations you give, the more people you get, and they just ended up in this is again the flywheel. It was almost impossible to compete with the recommendations of Amazon because they were so good already, and because they were so good, it kept getting better. Every single click contributed to an environment which was better, which made it very, very hard, still to this day, to actually compete with, and that is another form of flywheel.
Yeah. And this is like one of the concepts in this Good to Great book. I don't know, have anyone read it, or do you know of it? This is like the basic methodology between it is like they study why companies go from like being quite good to being super good. So they have sort of identified historically, I think it's 15 pairs of companies where like companies who had like for 15 years they should have been a stock price that has been going so, and then 15 years after that where it goes like much better than the market, and then they sort of close study the period where the companies change from being mediocre to great, and then they look at like so identifying certain companies like this, and then you identify other companies in the same industry which do not make the same leap. So you have like these two tested pairs to see that, okay, what did the companies that actually sort of turned great, what did they do? And the flywheel effect is one of these, like I think 5 or 6 or 7 principles that they have. And I've used another one of these principles in this book called first who, then what, which means that you sort of he has these examples of companies. So like first they decide who are the people who are going to do something together, and then they decide what they're going to do. So that you don't start with a vision of what you are trying to accomplish, but you start with the people who you want to collaborate with. Like a classic example is Compaq computers, for example. There was like a couple of people from Texas Instruments who knew that they didn't want to work at Texas, and they knew they wanted to start a company and knew they wanted to do it together, but they were sort of indifferent to what they would actually do. And I have this personal story. We have a center in Lund called the Lund Center for the History of Knowledge, which I've been part of sort of developing over the last 10 years. And it began as like a book club, I think in 2014, where we were like 3 or 4 people who did things together, and then we tried to sort of introduce an international field into Swedish academia, Nordic academia. And over the first 3, 4, 5 years, our focus was to sort of get people to use ideas which we have found, sort of. And we had a workshop at the castle here in Skåne, Häckeberga Castle. We had like nice people. We had great guests. We had a great time, and we wanted them to sort of do our thing together as a book, as how we understood the concept of circulation of knowledge. And what happened was that it was totally impossible. No one wanted to do what we wanted them to do, and we had no like fiscal measures to sort of actually force them to it. So we realized that okay, they will do what they do, and this was sort of a slow revelation over this building this field. Was that what I thought of as like sort of an intellectual endeavor to get people to understand certain things and do certain things, that proved impossible. But on the other hand, I learned that if you gather like good people together, interesting things can happen, sort of. So therefore, and I sort of shifted I never try to create anything now. I always start with the people. I first try to do things with good people, and if I like doing something with someone, then I try to do another thing with them. And then you sort of follow the people and try and see what happens. And it's a way of
if we come back here, you'll know that David likes me.
Yeah.
So that's the only way we'll genuinely know if this actually works in practice.
I very much believe in this thing.
I think also the opposite is true, though. I mean, it's sort of a management cliche, but I think there's some truth in it, which is the sort of the flip side of that is you join a company, but you quit a boss. You join the idea of like, working for IKEA, fantastic, sounds great, until you join IKEA and you realize your boss is an idiot, and then you leave the boss. You don't leave IKEA because the idea is still there, but you can't work in this situation. That I think is it's the same principle, but the opposite in a sense. If you can start fresh, then obviously start with the people and then figure out what you want to do.
Yeah.
But the opposite is also true.
It's also true, because it's very rare that something is worth it if the people, if it doesn't jive over a long time. So these are a couple of, and for me this was like, I mean, we discuss knowledge and concepts here, and sometimes you sort of read about something and then you try it, but a lot of things is that you read something and you realize, this gives me sort of a word for something which I have experienced. It relates back to something, and you sort of, it's like you discover a language so that you understand why something worked or didn't work at an earlier stage. And so to me this has been sort of it's an iterative thing, and
But speaking of things that have not worked so well, this is one of many. Ryan Holiday's book called Growth Hacker Marketing. Most of you have heard growth hacking, I assume, as a concept. I thought this is a good example of almost, a Silicon Valley concept that has become an orthodoxy in its own right. And what I mean by that is like you're almost assumed that this is how you need to do something, because that's what everyone's talking about, and that's the methodology and everything you read about it. And I tried to do this myself. I fell into this orthodoxy and thought, well, if everyone else is doing it, why could this not work for us? So we hired growth hackers and we had a growth team, and I spent millions of dollars and nothing worked. It was an absolute waste of time from beginning to end, because I fell into the orthodoxy that this is the method, this is how you market something, and it took us many, many years before we could figure out more specifically in our category, this actually is not very relevant. These methods don't really apply, and I think this is sort of the flip side of these Silicon Valley knowledge principles, in a sense that wherever you go, people talk about the same thing, and it's easy to say, well, the reason it doesn't work for you is that you're not very good at it. But it should work, because it worked for Uber, and it worked for Instagram, and all these other things. I think the message I want to send with this one specifically is, you're not necessarily Uber. It's you're not necessarily a good candidate to use all of these methods. Some maybe, but not necessarily all of them. And I spent millions of dollars, literally millions of dollars, thinking there's got to be a way. There's got to be a way I can make this work. And the short answer is no. There wasn't. There were other ways, however, and it took me much, much longer to get there had I not been stuck in this growth hacking orthodoxy.
How would you define growth hacking?
It's sort of a mixture of marketing and engineering. It's sort of comes out of sort of pure hustle culture. I think it's where sort of product, market, and engineering meet in the middle, and you're trying to sort of in a more cross-functional way, rather than just like I'm buying an ad and I'm hoping someone's going to click on it. But you're trying to sort of build it together in some sense. I think that principle is a reasonable idea. That marketing is not something that you just build on the side and you bolt on at the end. But this specific thing in my category at the time proved to be very, very difficult.
I think the classic example that's often used is Hotmail, for example, when they like the first webmail, where you had like everyone who sent an email with Hotmail said in the beginning, this was sent by Hotmail, register here for free. So that every time someone used, well, like if you use your iPhone, this was sent by an iPhone. Then like every time someone uses it, it's also like marketing just attached to it. Which is, and of course, when you see the graphs of these kind of things, for example, Hotmail or something like that, when it just like explodes without like having spent $1 on an ad.
It's very alluring.
Very alluring, because it's money for nothing. But the kids' recommendation loop did not involve that.
It's a very tricky thing, considering that what the user of the product, in my case, was not the buyer of the product, which is very unusual, because normally it is. If you're selling a B2B SaaS, you're probably talking to the person who you want to buy your product. But if you're selling a children's app, you're most likely not talking to the user. You're talking to the parent. This is actually, I think I said this before, but this is very similar to selling dog food. You're selling dog food, but you're not the user of the dog food. The dog is the user. The dog is eating the food. You're the owner of the dog, and you're a buyer of the dog. But the way what the dog is interested in and what you're interested in is two very different things.
Yeah.
And that means just a lot of these situations, a lot of these methods cannot be applied in any way. And clinging to them too hard, thinking that could also backfire.
Yeah. And I'd say the natural development here, Björn, I think is to go to like this one, the causal problem about network effects. Because I think networks effect is one of these concepts which you won't find here in Only the Paranoid Survive, because people didn't understand networks effect in 1995 because the world was not connected in that sense. But network effects are basically that things get more valuable the more users there are. So like email, for example, is much more useful if everyone has an email address. Whereas if just 1% of the population has one, it's not very useful. And certain products are like built on understanding this, like the social media companies, at least pre-TikTok, was very into the network effects. That is like what makes Facebook useful. It's because everyone is there. And why can't you leave Facebook? Because everyone is there.
And it's also better for me.
It's
Instagram is more fun for me if you're on it.
If you're on
I
it.
want you to join for my sake, not necessarily for your sake.
But for example, if you're a 2-year-old playing with Toca Boca, it doesn't get exponentially better if everyone has it. In a sense, maybe you're like your friend you can sit and play together, perhaps. But like the network effects are not what's driving the adoption. It's not the network that creates the value. And this thing, like about networks, this book is about how you actually get networks effects, and it's actually more about what he calls anti-network effects, because like networks effects are very, like when you have them, it's great. But he has these examples. For example, if you remember Google Plus, when Google wanted to become a social media company, that was like a digital ghost town. There was no one there. They had like 100 million users, but if you were in there, nothing really happened. And that is the anti-network effect, where you feel like, it's just you screaming into nothing happens. And that, I think, is something which many people have experiences of, like trying to do something. It would be great if a lot of people were here, but the hard part is to get like the first 5, 10, 15 people to actually care about it.
And that's the cold start.
That's the cold start.
That's what that is.
Yeah.
The cold start. How do you get off the ground?
How do you get off the ground? And say, for example, that and a lot of things I'd say have this is something which has sort of wrapped my head around a lot more about like these networks. Like I think about it, for example, books and movies and stuff like that, which is very much, I'd say, network. There are a lot of network effects. Like last year, for example, you remember that the Netflix show Adolescence, which almost everyone saw. So even if you didn't really care about it, it was good to see it, because then you could talk to people about it. And it was quite globally. A lot of Netflix show has that kind of thing, like campfire thing. And books have the same things. Like certain books are more valuable. For example, these books that both you and I have read, they are more valuable to us because we can talk about them. And if we can get more people to talk about them, then the fact that we have read them makes them more. So in a sense, if this kind of thing creates networks effects around certain things, that would be good.
How have you used network effects in your sort of professional career?
But I think I have one book here, Taught in Thiel, which I wrote a couple of years ago, which is about how you work and live in a good way. And when I first started writing books, I thought a lot about, like, if you get, say, a speaking engagement, you thought a lot like how many people are in the audience. That is, I think, and how many books do you sell? I think those are things that a lot of people who write books or try to market things think of, how many? But the network effect thing is that, say, for example, that if I get a chance to speak to like 200 people at Lund University, and they are all sitting in different departments, so no one of them know each other, I would say that is less valuable than for me to speak to one department where everyone gets to sort of read a book and have a book club about it. Maybe there are 15 people. Because if they read it and like it, then they will talk about it, and then that might spread. But while if you plant like 200 seeds, they have no chance, because then everyone has to sort of engage independently. And I mean, he has this example of Slack, for example, which a lot of people use for collaboration in work. And Slack is sort of, it's much better to have one small division who uses Slack and actually uses it, then you have to have like 1,000 users, but where they are like islands in a big corporate sea, because it will not be useful. So things are like the density of networks are very important. So instead of and this, I'm not sure if this is sort of concrete enough, but I think a lot about these kind of things, like how do you create networks of effects around things, and I didn't used to think like that. I don't saying that I have succeeded that many times, but sometimes, and that it changes the posture how you do. You think a lot more about the density than the volume of things. And I think if you want to make change, or if you want to make things happen, then because his idea is this, that if you actually create one atomic, he calls this atomic network. It's an atomic network is something which is sort of self-sustained. So Facebook began, and you had to have a Harvard address. So no one outside of Harvard could use Facebook. And when they had like maybe 80% of the people at Harvard, then they allowed Princeton to enter. And then in that sense, they sort of demonstrated that they kept the density high. And it was first at a much later stage where you go global. And that kind of sequencing to actually make sure that you dominate a small...
Yeah, it has a high enough value in a small group, I think. And I think what's interesting about it is it sounds sort of obvious when you talk about it, but this was not obvious not that long ago.
No,
like you say, in
the 90s this was not obvious.
In the 90s this was not around. There was just... it probably was. It wasn't defined in that way, and it wasn't talked about in that way, and it wasn't so that you could write a 400-page book on the notion of how to create it either necessarily. So there are new things that enter and sort of change it and put words around things that, I mean, obviously the idea had happened, but it wasn't as strong. And obviously having digital connections, it helps.
And arguably it becomes more important in an interconnected world. Because like the things, if you actually create a lot of atomic networks all over the world, like the globe, the possibility is that something can have billions of users, and a lot of things in the past did not, like the ceiling was not that high. But for software, which is so cheap to sort of distribute, and like it's just you just have to get people to join. So like the snowball can get very, very, very big. But the paradox in that is that if you want to make that big snowball, then you have to think very, very small, because it's a crowded space. And I think this is something which we still don't understand that so well. But I think people today, and the people who know the most, they understand this much better than people did in the 70s or 80s, or 90s.
For sure. It's sort of an emerging field.
Yeah,
it feels old in a sense, but it's actually considerably younger than maybe
and it's so easy to overlook, because most products or bands or films or whatever, when we encounter them, then they are already past the cold start stage.
Because if they weren't, you wouldn't have heard of them.
If they weren't, you wouldn't have heard of them. So like when I look at Melodifestivalen with my 5-year-old, then like the people there, who is this person? Oh, they won the Idol competition 3 years ago. I mean, they don't come from nowhere. They have gathered their audience, and I have not been part of that. But at a certain stage, things try to tip into the bigger things.
I mean, I'd say a lot of companies, probably the ones that you work for as well, you're part of this in some shape, but you're not necessarily designing for it. There's a difference in just sort of acknowledging that you're in a network, or actively trying to fix it or address, like, why are we in this market and not in this one? Or why are we growing well here but we're not growing well over there? So there's also a difference between sort of, I recognize the idea, and then working with it specifically. This is a method. This is something I want to use in order to go from this place to another place, or in order to accelerate something further as well. That's, I think, a bit of the challenge of talking about these concepts. They're so familiar, but that doesn't mean you're working with them in the way that you could. You've maybe heard of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it works.
And I'd say the logical thing here, Björn, is maybe to go to this book again. Because this is like making an atomic network. It is like going for something that doesn't exist to make something exist. And this is like, I'd say, the primer on. I mean,
that's the title of the book, isn't it? Going from 0 to 1, going from nothing to something. It's a very there's a lot of concepts in here, and in fact that you could look at that are quite interesting. I mean, one of them is avoiding competition.
Yeah.
As we spoke about in the first session as well. Like, how do you, instead of going up against competing with companies, how do you ensure that you do not have to compete at all? How do you find your own market where there's nothing there? What have you done to avoid? How have you avoided competition?
I keep trying, and he has this sentence in this book that is that if you can understand competition as a sign of something not being very valuable, then you are more sane than most. So that it's like avoiding competition is to him is a sanity concept, and many people are attracted to competition, especially perhaps in certain of competitive areas like academia or like parts of business. And I used to play a card game called Magic the Gathering, where you travel around the world and played like tournaments and trying to win money and trying to be the best. And it was it's the hardest thing I've done, I'd say. Like very dedicated people, it's very, very competitive at the top. But at one stage I realized sort of that like if I don't win this tournament, then someone else will, and who cares? It's like in most sports it's like that. Yeah, you didn't win the gold medal, but someone else did. It's like you don't create excess value. It's you distribute a finite pool of status or money or prize money, something like that. It's not, and Thiel would say that's a losing game. You are entering a fixed competition with a fixed ceiling. Why would you pour your heart and soul into that when you can sort of create what is unknown? And I think of that sometimes also in my profession, for example, that if I say that there are courses at my department which we teach every semester, and if I don't teach it, someone else will. And it might be a little bit better, it might be a little bit worse, but it's not like you don't add tremendous value at that place. It can be done by a lot of people. And my thinking, and I think it has crystallized through this book, is because I think I've seen myself as a competitive person. I've enjoyed competition since I was a child, for love of the game and for trying to compete and be the best at various things. But today, I'd say I try to do things that I try to spend as much time as possible doing things which would not have been done if I hadn't done them. So, for example, the things that we do here today, if we don't do this, no one will. Not here, and perhaps not anywhere else.
You will have your lunch break back.
You will have your lunch break back. But this kind of things, like my colleagues don't do these kind of things. And other historians don't read these kind of books. And that's what makes me valuable, that I am both an historian and that I'm interested in these kind of books, for example. That is sort of my value proposition. And I understand that that is a sort of a value proposition to sort of do the things that others don't, and which if you didn't do them, who would do them? And if the answer is no one, then that is an indication that that might be worth pursuing. Yeah. While if the answer is that, then someone else would. Okay.
I'd say it could be a way of defining yourself as well, isn't it? It becomes sort of a way of carving out space for yourself. Like instead of Tokaboka being a kids game company, we were market leaders in digital toys, which was a space that was empty. Yeah. We were almost the only ones there. Like we defined a new category for ourselves, saying, well, we're not a gaming company. Yeah. So don't think of us like that. We're a digital toy company, which happened to be a category that was literally empty. There was no one in it of any scale, of any use. It was semantics, you could argue, but it was also a different way of defining what we were trying to do. Yeah. We're not another one of those gaming companies. We're something completely different.
And I'd say we can go to what you write, for example, your position as a journalist today.
Yeah,
I'd say that is sort of a similar way, right?
It is, and I think.
Who are you competing with?
Well, as few as possible is the thing. Although I guess Dagens Industri is the obvious one, but I think it introduces another concept which also you're probably familiar with, called the moat. I mean, the moat is essentially whatever was around a fortress in the old day with just water around it so that you couldn't invade the fortress. That's where it comes from. The moat, I think, as a sort of a startup concept, is similar to this. If you don't have any competition, you're not as worried about this. But the moat is what can you do uniquely for yourself that others have a hard time doing. And that depends on how you define yourself. Because if you're saying, I'm a car manufacturer, All right, how many other car manufacturers are there? There's a lot. What's your moat as, David and Björn's car company? The moat, as it stands on this philosophical level, pretty slim. Two guys who've never built a car with a great idea of building a four-wheeled vehicle. This doesn't sound great. The moat is very limited. Whereas, like, I'm going to build I'm going to be Elon Musk. I'm going to build a completely new, from scratch, electrical vehicle in a time where there are none. I'm going to redesign the factories entirely to completely circumvent the combustion engine and only do it. Like, how would you build an electric car if that was the only thing you were ever building, and you're not retrofitting an old car factory, you're building a new one? That's a pretty significant moat, because getting to that point is quite tricky. But this also works in a personal space. You can think about it for yourself, because my writing has quite a strong moat. Now, it's binary in a sense. You could say, well, I'm a tech analyst for a Swedish newspaper, but I have 20 plus years of experience from business, and I have 8 years from Silicon Valley. So this gives me a perspective that almost no other writing journalist in Sweden has. That doesn't make it interesting. It just means I have a moat. It means I can write about certain sorts of things in a way with credibility that others have a very hard time doing. Now again, the moat cannot be mixed up with just it's a good business. Because you could be very unique in doing things that nobody wants. There's plenty of people doing that, myself included. But the moat is an interesting concept to think about, sort of how the way in which you define what you do also contributes to your moat. You're doing something, again, if you're not thinking about competing, it's pretty hard to compete with. You could make the case for Media Evolution as we are right now. This is a pretty unique thing. It doesn't have a lot of competition. You can rent a desk and whatnot, but that's not really what this place is doing. It's one of many things, but it's not actively competing with other places. If you just want a desk, there's no reason to come here. But if you want other things, conversations like these, many other events happening, other sorts of sense of community and whatnot, this is a different beast. And in a sense, this is very actively building a moat, saying, we're not just a desk company. We're not contributing with desk. We're doing that, but we're also doing many other things. That is a pretty significant moat in the context of this space that we're all in physically.
And then the issue is, of course, if it's viable.
Yeah.
Right. So if we keep jumping around in this. We spoke about this one in the first one. This is also one of these classics that are all over the world. The Lean Startup, which introduces this concept of the minimum viable product, which you sort of iterate on, the design thinking. And the key thing which Björn, which you took up earlier in the conversation, is the viable thing. A lot of people can build minimum products are quite common, but the viable thing is that it actually has some kind of traction at the market, that people want to do it voluntarily, in a sense. And that is, this goes back to all of these things. Like, I think this kind of design thinking, I think, is something which goes through a lot of these books.
It is.
They
don't talk about it in that way, but that is essentially what it is.
Essentially what it is. It's a kind of and engineering concepts that are sort of very common in an engineering or design setting, which might not be as common in a classic business setting or something like that. That you sort of, or a life making session. So you sort of take these things to different places.
And I think that's the way you can think about these things as well. As I think it's easy to read this as most of these books as a startup manual.
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong way of reading it, personally. And I think that's what these 3 sessions have tried to do in some sense, is sort of saying there's actually, in some sense, there's much more here than that. This is not a startup manual. This is not. If it were, then we could have done it at Mink.
Yeah.
If this is only what you need to do in a startup. But it's also probably not just the opposite either. It's not. It's not as simple as like, if it just follows 0 to 1, you'll have a very successful company. But there are fragments and methods and analogies that could be useful. Sometimes in personal life, I think your own book is a good example of lending, familiar concepts and sort of applying them to you personally, or you can apply it to your company or your organization as well.
Yeah.
They're actually quite applicable on many levels,
Yeah.
much maybe more so than I think people have understood.
And that you try things first. I mean, I've thought of this as an example of this, the minimum viable product. I mean, this is a book, so it's not minimum viable anymore. But it started as like, I write some in newspapers as Björn does, and I was approached by a publisher in Stockholm who said, "Oh, I like your writing. Maybe we should do a book together." So we had a talk, and he said, "Can you give me just 10 ideas of books that you could possibly write, topics that you would be interested in covering?" So I gave him 10 things, and I took some of these texts that I had been writing about, and then on the next meeting he said, "Okay, but which one of your texts have most people read?" And then there is this one text in this. The first thing here is about doing less, working shorter hours, but getting more things done. And that was, I think, the third most read essay in Svenska Dagbladet in 2021 or something like that. And people, okay, let's do a book about that, was his take. So it wasn't, when I wrote the text, I didn't think of it as doing a minimum viable product, but as a publisher, thinking of an author is like, okay, what are they doing that people actually enjoy? And then we go big on that. I mean, it's very obvious when I say it like this, but in my world, in academia, this is very non-obvious. People never don't think in numbers and don't...
and they try things out in that.
They try things out, but don't try things out in that sense. And that kind of... I'm writing a book right now, a sequel to this one, and a lot of the things there is like you try things in public and see what resonates, and then if it doesn't, then that's no hard feelings. I mean, it was good trying it. I mean, you do things that are good in and of themselves. At least I do. I like most of the text I write. I like they are worth it just because I did it.
Yeah.
I got to do it. That's worth it. But if then it also has this sort of what do you say? Possible upside, where like it might lit a spark. And you don't really know until you, and this book would say that you can never really know that if you never release products on the market. And I think it's sort of the same with text and research ideas. I mean, before you write an application, you should talk to people about your new idea and see if they somehow find it interesting. And then if no one finds it interesting, well, then the grant agencies will probably not find it interesting as well. So that you sort of test early, test often, test all the time, and then once you get traction, then it might be important to go big.
Yeah.
Sam Altman has this saying, I think I quote him in this book, that like a lot of people learn from their mistakes. That's quite common. But what surprises him is that so many people are bad at learning from their successes. That is, they find something that works and then they don't do it again. Which, from his perspective, is stupid. Like, if people liked it, why don't you do more of it? I mean, and to him that is sort of as dumb as keep doing that which does not work.
Yeah.
And
it's almost a fallacy in the sense that you feel like you need to develop, but maybe you should stand still and dig where you are.
Yeah. But a lot of success, at least in business, is of course about repeating the things or doing more of the things that work. Like getting your best customers to buy 10% more instead of trying to find 10% more customers.
Yeah.
Like focus on what matters. And this is a way. A lot of these books are about like getting to what matters and understanding that what matters. Like the best thing to matter is, of course, if you find something which no one else are doing. Peter Thiel has this quote in this book that he wondered, like, what valuable company is nobody building? And that forces you to not look at what can I do the next search engine or the next vibe coding thing. It's like, what are they not doing? And for example, if you look here in Media Evolution, like who else are trying to sort of get people from these different worlds together? No one. And if the answer is no one, and that you have the traction of the viability, then push that, and push on the things that is hard to replicate. And
I think there's a tangent going from these little small. Testing in public, like you say, there's a concept. We're going to sort of end on a sort of a final concept. There's a lot of people talking about the notion of something being of a venture scale. That is something that keeps repeating as well. Things that are they sufficiently large Are they sufficiently even fundable normally? It's like, is this something that someone would actually invest in, which could be large enough? I think I'd want to encourage thinking that that is a specific category of things, but there are so many other things worth building that are not of venture scale. And I think the Silicon Valley knowledge that is incorrect is that things need to be of venture scale in order to be valuable. That's not true. They need to be of venture scale if you're going to live off venture capital the coming 10 years. Then you need to sell an idea that is so stupendously huge that the notion of you succeeding is going to be a very interesting financial outcome for everyone backing you. But the most companies in the world, the most projects, ideas, academia, books being written, they are not of venture scale. And even if it's not a venture scale, I would argue there's a lot of interesting things in it. What we're doing right now, this is the opposite of venture scale. This is an entirely free, non-investable, with no commercial, this has no venture scale whatsoever. But you could argue, and you may disagree, that this is not a complete waste of time, even if you can't invest in it. And it depends how you look upon it. But I think this is also one of these things that's been caught up in what maybe people think of Silicon Valley as, we just need to fund it as much as possible, burn all this money, we'll figure out how we're going to get there later. Everything does not need to be of venture scale. That is a very, very specific subset of companies. The majority of companies in any city, Malmö, Silicon Valley, or anything else, is not of venture scale, and they're doing great. It's like Ben's restaurant. This is not venture scale, but it's a great place. And it's never going to grow to become sort of a world-leading chain with things everywhere, and it does not need to be. And I think a lot of people, maybe when you read these books, you get caught up in building something that is enormously huge, and maybe you cap other ideas, thinking, I can't do this, it's too small. There's no one's going to invest in this, no one's going to do these sorts of things. I would encourage you to not draw that conclusion from Silicon Valley. That is a very, very specific subset of ideas that has super high risk, enormous rewards if you were to get it right, and most things do not. Most things in Silicon Valley fail, and they die, and they crash and burn very, very hard. That type of building projects and ideas is not for everyone. And I think that in some way summarizes how to think about Silicon Valley, what to do, and maybe also what not to do. Let's see if we have some questions.
Yes, sure. Hi, my name is Trim. I work as an innovation advisor during the day.
Great.
And, this question pops up a lot when it comes to building something really big, or when some things are really small. Mentioning that V in that MVP, I think I gave some reflections there. Really lovely choice of books. I think it made a little bit of a red thread here. I saw the Ryan Holiday. He's done a lot of books regarding stoicism as well. I see the Peter Thiel. You mentioned technocracy and the techno-optimists a little bit in the beginning. There's something when it comes to stoicism, the force of that you have choices, and the choice is to be able to find your truth. What is a truth for you? And because there are many truths out there. For a period of time right now where we've come from mentioning growth from the 90s, things have changed a lot since then. We've had so many different advances when coming that we've had dial-up, we have Wi-Fi, we have 5G, we've gone to cloud technology, we've gone to blockchain, and these truths are changing over time. Now we have certain large truths that are put in front of our faces really often. We say that, well, the way to go is the big startup. The way how to build a company is filling in a business model canvas, and that's the only way to go. How do we keep fairness regarding this sort of truth, regarding our philosophy, regarding our morality, when these issues and these philosophies of technocracy are romanticized and invested in more than ever?
It's a tricky one. I think I think actually if I understand sort of the heart of your questions correctly, is part of the reason why we wanted to do this. I think it is often very misunderstood. And I think there's a lot more to draw upon. I think you can end up in two camps. I think I alluded to that in the beginning. You're either like, this is how you run companies, and that's, business model canvas, all the whole lean startup, MVP. Wherever you go in the world, you step into the equivalent of Mink anywhere, and everyone speaks in the exact same way. And that is an interesting historical fact. Why did that end up being? But there's also then the other end of it, which is sort of like, why would we want to listen to anything that Peter Thiel has to say? Why do we want to have anything to do with this man? He seems like someone who does not share my values, you could think. And that a lot of people feel that way too. It's like we're being governed by a bunch of technocrats that may or may not have my best interest in mind. I think, I don't know your conclusion, but my conclusion would be it's probably not either of those two. I think maybe if you're leaning in one or too many, one or the other end of this, personally, I think you're missing the point. I think that there are things to be learned from this. I think that the ultimate orthodoxy, if you can think this way, is say something that Donald Trump has done, which is good. Bad, anyone has a list. But if you can say something that is actually done good, then you're intellectually honest about it. Peter Thiel is the same way, regardless of how you think about his political affiliations. What's in there that is genuinely useful? I think there are some things. I think there are some things Donald Trump has done well. A minority maybe, but there's something there, and there's something intellectually honest to that. So being all in or all out is not a super interesting perspective, for me personally, at least. And diving into these with sort of curiosity is a way of at least finding some value in these things.
And maybe also this indifferentiation, which I think is like it's proclaimed in all these in this literature, though it's perhaps not always lived in a sense. But that is these things to avoid competition and to like double down on what makes your take unique as an individual or a company or a place. I think that is to me that is a philosophy which we can safeguard a lot of good things, and it's not about being being and thinking like everyone else. It's about also having these kind of combinations. And a lot, I mean, if you read these kind of things, it feels like the whole world is software, but it's not. It's a small portion, and if that disappeared, then the world would keep turning. And to have these kind of perspectives, I mean, I think it's very. If this is the only thing you read, I think you have a very slim view of the world. On the other hand, if you have never touched anything like this, if you are a reading person and you haven't touched this literature, I think you are ignorant of an important part of the world today. I think this is Bildung in the classic sense. So it's something which I think more people should dip their toe into, because there's so much you will not understand if you don't actually care about this world. If you just use the products, which everyone does, but you don't understand that it's made by people.
Maybe that's it. Then maybe Martin can wrap us up.
I wanted to wrap us up by welcoming you back. So on Wednesday morning, we have two people here giving a lecture, and they are the authors of one of the best books in our library, specifically in the foresight section. And it's two people called Scott Smith and Susan Cox Smith. They've written a book called Futures Cultures, and they're going to talk about how to build adaptive organizations. And if you want more of you and people like yourself, on Friday morning there's coffee and croissant, as per usual, the last Friday of each month. So you're super welcome back for that as well. And before we end, I want your help to give a big applause to Björn and David for taking the time and presenting.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.